Lively and unrehearsed as always, this is our weekly conversation, moral side of the news, and we're glad you're here. I'm John Blim with the WHAS Crusade for Children. With me, as always, is a distinguished panel this week, and we say Happy New Year to Rabbi Gaylia Rooks from the Temple, Dr. Marian Taylor, South Frankfort Presbyterian Church, Reverend Clay Calloway, West Louisville Ministers Coalition, and Father Joe Graffis, Archdiocese of Louisville. Our first topic today: with COVID-related infections and deaths at an all-time high in Kentucky, Governor Andy Beshear called a special session of the General Assembly to address the Commonwealth's alarming numbers. This is in the wake of the Kentucky Supreme Court ruling that a lower court was wrong to block new laws that limit the governor's emergency powers. And so the Republicans' legislative supermajority has a substantial say over any new public measures to address the pandemic. So panelists, we want to hear what you have to say. We all want the pandemic to end. How will this shift of power work toward that goal?
I think clearly it works against it. It appears that the regulations, the thinking of the supermajority Republican appears to be more, troglodyte in its dimensions. It's going backwards instead of forward. The masks clearly protect life. I recently had someone explain to me the effect of the vaccine and the effect of the mask. In a very simple term, it's the difference between suicide and homicide. The vaccine protects you as an individual. It protects you as your protection. The mask is protecting your neighbor, is loving your neighbor. So it prevents the spread of the deadly virus. So the vaccine protects you, the mask protects your neighbor, protects others. It's the difference between suicide and homicide, to use a very graphic description. So by the legislation blocking the ability of this governor to protect life, which is what the masks do, then you're going against the very principle of this country, where it says we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life is number one, liberty is number two, and pursuit of happiness is number three. So it goes against the very principles of this country and priorities that government should exist in the first place. So I think that it's clearly going backwards and not forward, and for them to always go with something that blocks, something that protects life, appears to be clearly going in the wrong direction. That's what this legislation, I think, is doing in effect.
Don't know whether they've really clearly stated what, they've talked about a lot of principles. I haven't seen legislation that exactly states that. One of the things that perhaps I kind of agree with much of what you've said, Clay, but to mandate for an entire state when everybody is very different and different regions, I do think the local option of whether it's a local school board or a local city should have the right to say, in our area, because of where we are, we must do this, whereas County X that has 90% vaccinated may not have to do that. So
do we have a county that's 90% vaccinated?
No. I was just using that as an exaggerated example.
That is exaggerated, I might add.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well,
we're 55%, I think, as though the state has at least one form of it. But I do think there is some balance to local communities making that decision. Now, banning those from making decisions, which some other states are doing, where you can't use any kind of mandates on masks, I find that revolting.
Yeah, to me, that's, in Judaism, the highest priority is pikuach nefesh, the saving of a life. And
there you go.
Any of the other, I think I might have said this on the show a few weeks ago, but like the Sabbath laws for, very strict Orthodox Jews who don't drive on the Sabbath or use electricity. If you're having a heart attack, you need to call 911. You need to ride in an ambulance, even though you're not supposed to be, in a motorized vehicle or travel. The saving of a life overrides all the other things. So to me, it should be put in that category in terms of the vaccine, that we are responsible to protect our own lives. There are some people who have religious objections to that. And that is their right. I'm not saying people should be forced to be vaccinated, but the mask mandate is what upsets me the most, and especially in our schools. You know, children under 12 are still not eligible for the vaccine. They are so precious and tender. They are making up more and more and more of the new cases being admitted to the hospital. Very scary, more and more of the deaths even. And you can't protect your own child if the other people aren't willing to help you protect your own child. And we want our kids to be in school, of course we do, but it's very scary. And I think that everyone who is around our children, that's other children and teachers and cafeteria workers and custodians, everyone needs to be wearing masks to protect our children. And how that piece of cloth is an infringement on a person's rights is a point that I am not very accepting of. I've given the example before about, there are just certain things that infringe on our liberties, like stopping at a red light, or and also in terms of the stress on our healthcare system. You have to wear a seatbelt. That's not even protecting anyone else. That's just protecting you. But it's the law. It's an infringement on our personal liberties, but it's because we really need, not to have that. I was just popped into my head was that someone yesterday was saying there should be a separate insurance pool for people who are refusing to be vaccinated, because it's not even about the money at this point. It's about getting ICU care and beds. And, I have a friend who had to have her gallbladder out as an emergency, and they kept postponing it. Hospitals used to be there for other things besides COVID, and we still need them to be there for other things besides COVID. But I'm very frustrated. I agree with Clay that we're kind of moving backwards instead of forwards.
Well, I like what you said, Gaylia, about the emphasis on the preservation of human life. And I had kind of a new thought about all this, and that makes me think that the tragedy is that the way this debate gets framed is who decides, and that becomes a party politics football. I was talking to a local school board member, who has children of her own and is very passionately interested in protecting them. And she's visited schools and taken a look for herself. And she also knows personally the people who work in her county's health department. And it occurred to me then that what really needed to happen from the get-go was for school boards all to have a committee that they would authorize to work on this one issue, and that they would work on it in tandem with their county health department, and that they would visit the schools and come up with concrete recommendations and pass those based on the science that they would be getting from the health department. Because there are things like cracking windows open to improve ventilation. There are things like approaching nearby churches and synagogues and YMCAs about borrowing space so that children could sit farther from each other. There are all kinds of very practical things that if we had just focused entirely on the preservation of life, we wouldn't be having all these debates. The debates are important in a democracy. There isn't one answer to, who gets to decide, and we have to thrash that out. But in the meantime, it's just an agony for parents and families, and that we could have spared ourselves that with a kind of a very practical collaboration between local health departments and school boards.
Well, but I think the governor was trying to have a leadership role when he, stepped out and said that this is an emergency situation and that his emergency powers should not be curtailed.
You mentioned the leadership of the governor, but I'm amazed at the leadership of big business. And I've been taking some cues from big business. Big business seems to be more in accord with the CDC. And when it comes to big business, they're kind of leading the way in a lot of respects in this sense. If you look at what, say, the big automobile plants are doing in this state, take a Ford, take a Toyota, both of them require masks on the property and in the production facilities. They do not require vaccination as a personal choice. But when it comes to being on the property and in the physical area where production is taking place, you have to wear a mask. That's a mandate, and it's a mandate for business purposes. And they seem to be in direct contradiction to the direction of these legislatures in Frankfort that don't want to require masks to be worn. So now you have big business at odds with big government in the state. And in this particular case, it seems that the big business, Toyota and Ford in particular, are following conventional wisdom about wearing masks and what good can be derived from that simple measure that could protect the lives of the workers and protect the business and the profits of the business. So I think the businesses, believe it or not, are giving some level of leadership that is worthy of some consideration in this particular instance as it relates to the state of Kentucky.
And as we've talked about this several times before, freedom does not come free. And whether that's somebody serving in the armed forces or whatnot, but my freedom is limited by the common good of everyone else. That's basic to the Judeo-Christian culture, and I believe even in the Muslim community, Islam, that, love of neighbor, love of God. How do we balance that? It's not always about me, it's about we. And somehow we have not communicated that to so many of our people who think it's all about me and my freedom. And they've really gone off the deep end on that.
Right. And we got to remember what huge human losses we're still incurring as a result. Just in the last week, a dear friend of mine, Lewis Washington, died, and he had been vaccinated, but he had other health vulnerabilities. And so somehow somebody transmitted to him the Delta variant. And he was given oxygen, and then he was put on a ventilator, and then he died. And he was an enormous figure in the sort of music and cultural scene of Louisville. I wouldn't have met my husband if he hadn't decided to take us out on a blind double date so that we would meet each other. He has inspired worship for so many different congregations and so many schools, and he's gone now, and it was avoidable. It was avoidable.
You mentioned death by name. Had in my church, members had a family member that passed this past week that was not vaccinated, but she died because of COVID as well. I'm identifying more and more people by name that's dying from COVID. And even though you're vaccinated, the person that was vaccinated was the victim of the variant being transmitted by somebody else. And a mask would have prevented that. Mm-hmm. So that's yet another reminder, a sad reminder, that these masks can prevent the transmission. Mm-hmm. And when I gave the analogy, the difference between homicide and suicide, you could say that the person who transmitted the virus was complicit in the death, which is what homicide is. So it's sad, it's graphic, but it's very true.
Well, as well as the names, I think at this point we've all been touched by people we know who have died of COVID. But I'm not on Facebook, so occasionally a friend sends me a meme so that I can keep up with what's going on. And I think I got this like a few weeks ago, but it was so powerful to me. I still remember it. It said in the last 2 weeks, more humans died of COVID in the last 2 weeks in the state of Florida than in all 20 years of the war in Afghanistan. More Americans, more American military, I'm doing a great job on this.
I get it.
Americans died of COVID in Florida in 2 weeks than American military died in the war in Afghanistan over 20 years. And somehow that really, numbers, big numbers, it's so hard to get a handle on them and to see each one as a face, each one as a mother or a father, a son or a daughter. It's overwhelming, the number of people who have died, when so much of it, not all of it, obviously, but so much of it would have been preventable. And in the epidemic in 2017, they were wearing cloth on their faces then.
Absolutely.
A good start to our program, panel. Thanks for your thoughts on the pandemic and the new powers by the legislature. Now we'll move on to our second topic. A sobering anniversary is upon us. It's 20 years since we watched the attacks of September 11th, 2001. Nearly 3,000 people died that day, and shockwaves were felt worldwide. I wonder, panelists, if you would share your reflections on 9/11 and what we have learned since.
I want to just dovetail on what Gaylia just said. A thought came into my mind. She contrasted the 2 weeks versus the 2 decades. And it's been 2 decades since 9/11. And we are under attack by another invisible enemy that is taking lives. I remember shortly after 9/11, we were concerned about the attack of anthrax that was being transmitted through the mail and so forth. It was like an invisible enemy. So, Gail, you mentioned 2 weeks of deaths in Florida compared to 20 years, but 2 decades. So now you're contrasting 2 weeks versus 2 decades. And where are we now in this war? We are at war with this invisible enemy of COVID, and we don't seem to be doing a very good job at that as we did with the war in Afghanistan either. So we can learn something by the body count. Sad to say, death is death. You're just as dead whether you're killed by a bullet in Afghanistan or killed by a virus transmitted by an unmasked person in Florida. You're just as dead, or in Kentucky, you're just as dead. So I think you can have, it's the contrast of the 2 decades of the past 20 years, what we've learned and what we haven't learned. It seems like the more things change, the more things stay the same. And I don't know if we are that much smarter today than we were 20 years ago, sad to say.
I think one of the interesting things is that while there were many good things that happened after 9/11 in terms of the country coming together, where today we're not together about a lot of things. Although on the other hand, there was a lot of anti-immigrant, especially anti-Arab, anti-Muslim response as well that we still have remnants of today. But I think the idea of coming together, I recall I was in Jerusalem on 9/11 and just come out of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which is 9 in New York. And we were walking around the old walled city, and somebody said, something's happening in your country. And they had a TV on, and we saw the second plane go in the middle of Jerusalem. And I'll never forget, like we're saying, we're in the hot spot of the Middle East. What the heck? But, and I could tell a lot of stories, but the next morning we had dial-up internet, so we couldn't find out everything, although we did have CNN International. We went out in the village, which was a Muslim village, to go to an internet cafe. And we stand out like Americans in the middle of this village. People came out of the stores into the streets. I mean, we're like, what's happening here? and several people come up to us, "Are you all Americans? We are so sorry for what's happened in your country. It's against our religion. It's against who we are as a people. We are with you." And it's like, oh my God. I mean, I'll never forget that experience. And every time I went into the store the next 2 months, somebody said, "Oh, cup of coffee. We need to talk." And which was, my whole experience was just the opposite of what a lot of people had in a whole other part of the world where there's division. But I keep remembering we're all human at heart. And that certainly came through that day.
That's a powerful story, Joe, and I'm glad you shared that. I mean, we all feel such sadness and trauma from what happened that day, and we can use that to build our sense of compassion for people who are traumatized and under attack in all kinds of situations around the world. We're not used to these things happening on our territory, but a lot of people are, unfortunately, have to get used to terrible attacks happening on their territory, and maybe we can widen our hearts up a little bit on that. The other thing I wanted to say is, I think it's related to the mask mandate debate about who decides, that one of the things that went wrong, I think, after 9/11 was that the US Congress gave the executive branch too much latitude to make decisions. And as a result, we got diverted from what we were trying to accomplish in Afghanistan and got diverted into Iraq. And I think the Iraq War was a terrible mistake. So this is why I'm careful how I speak about these debates about who decides, because it is really important to not give your executive too much latitude. And I think that is exactly what happened after 9/11. The whole course of the last 2 decades could have gone better, I think, if that we had not given the latitude to just go into Iraq and cause all that harm that was done.
To get back to Joe's other side of the world experience in Jerusalem on 9/11 and the weeks following, I was here in Louisville. One of the things that my husband and I did was to call different people and say, "Can we take you out to dinner? There's something we'd like to talk about." And people had no idea what. And we would take them to different Arab-owned restaurants in town. And that was really the goal of what we were doing. And when I would say, "Oh, let's meet down at Saffron's," and they would say, "Oh, but they're Arabs," and I'm like, "Yeah, they're Americans." Like Saffron's doesn't exist anymore, which I'm very sad about. But Majid, you could have, you could have gone bowling in the middle of Arab-owned restaurants, because Americans were boycotting them, or some of the people that we invited for lunch or dinner would say, I don't feel safe going to that restaurant because, we're worried. And I said, no, we need to do this. We need to be a presence and not lump everyone into, us and them. It's we, it's all of us. And here we are again. I think that Islamophobia is, it waxes and wanes only a little. It never really goes away. It never really gets better. To me, it feels, like anti-Semitism. Sometimes it's more blatant and sometimes it's more covert. But there's just a lot of it there, and many other prejudices. And we have to just really, really work on standing together and providing everyone equality and compassion and whatever help we can.
Gaylia, I've often described Louisville as being progressive and regressive at the same time. It can be arguably one of the most progressive cities, and at the same time be the most regressive city at the same time. We forget that Louisville, Kentucky is the home, the birthplace of probably arguably the most famous Muslim American, that's Muhammad Ali. Okay. So much so we named the Muhammad Ali Museum, which involved public funds, and also renamed the airport. It's the only airport in the United States that bears a Muslim name, Muhammad Ali International Airport. So that whole situation with 911, ironically enough, they looked at Ali at the time. He got catapulted into the national limelight again to help get some insight and some understanding about Islam. And he served well in that capacity. And Louisville has gone on to rename the airport, as I said before. So we have come a long way in many respects. We still have a long way to go. And Louisville, ironically enough, has been a very interesting venue for that avenue of enlightenment in many ways. And I'm very hopeful about our city to help continue that enlightened journey.
I think the other thing since 9/11 was also with the Center for Interfaith Relations has done so much work over the last 20 years, especially with our Muslim brothers and sisters, Hindu, all the world religions, trying to help us to understand our common ground, which is probably far more than most of us have ever realized in the past when we live in our little tribes sometimes. And I think, some of the real leaders of interfaith Path to Peace is some of our Muslim brothers and sisters. And so, like you said, I think, yes, we're very progressive in some areas and very regressive in other areas. But maybe that describes our city pretty well.
Yeah, both at the same time, a little schizophrenic.
Yeah.
But we're working on it, right?
We're working on it.
This is a new year in Judaism, and so it's a great New Year's resolution for everyone.
Yes, happy Rosh Hashanah.
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
Give us
That's
a
it.
quick.
That's the Mass.
Yes. Give
Yom
us a
Kippur
quick
coming up, we could all do a lot of atonement.
Mhm.
Right.
We have-
Help us out. Pronounce it for us, Gaylia. Is it Rosh Hashanah or Hashanah or?
In Hebrew, it's Rosh Hashanah. In Yiddish, which most people think is English, is Rosh Hashanah. The act. So yeah, and Yom Kippur or Yom Kippur. So it's.
Gotcha.
That's a good way to end our program. With a happy new year and best wishes to all, and thanks to our panel, Rabbi Gaylia Rooks, Dr. Marian Taylor, Reverend Clay Calloway, and Father Joe Graffis. Thanks for your time on this edition of Moral Side of the News. We'll be back again next week as the lively conversation continues. Thanks, panel. See you next time.